iron wheels screamed a rhythmic protest against the rails, a sound that had become the beat of Ruthie's own frantic heart. Each clatter, each lurch of the carriage, was a measure of distance. Distance from a clapboard house that smelled of sulfur and stale whiskey. Distance from a man whose hands were as cold and hard as the steel of the guns he sold. A man her father, in a moment of debt-fueled desperation, had called her husband. Dust was the first and last thing you knew in the train car. It coated the rough-hewn wooden benches in a fine, gritty powder. It hung in the afternoon sunbeams that sliced through the grimy windows, dancing in lazy columns of gold. It tasted of alkali flat and far-off cattle drives, and it settled in the back of Ruthie's throat, a constant, choking reminder of the unforgiving land she was throwing herself into. The air was thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and something sour that might have been spilled liquor. It was a man's world, this car, and she was a ghost within it. She had been huddled in the corner for what felt like days, though the sun's slow arc suggested it had only been hours. Her dress, once a respectable calico, was torn at the hem from her scramble through the rail yard, a dark smudge of grease staining the faded blue flowers. Beneath it, her knees were raw and scraped from a fall she didn't have time to feel. Her entire life had been compressed into the small, lumpy cloth bundle clutched in her lap. A spare chemise, a half-eaten biscuit, and a small, smooth river stone her mother had given her years ago. It was nothing, and it was everything. Her eyes, wide and the color of a stormy sky, darted from face to face. She saw prospectors with greed etched into the lines around their eyes, their gazes lingering on her with a speculative hunger that made her skin crawl. She saw tired farmhands, their faces burned brown by the sun, too exhausted to be a threat but too numerous to offer any comfort. A man in a waistcoat that had seen better days watched her from under the brim of his hat, a deck of cards held loosely in his hands. He smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips, and she quickly looked away, her stomach twisting into a cold knot. They were all strangers, a gallery of potential dangers. Any one of them could be him, any one of them could be worse. She had to move. The conductor would come through again soon, his voice a gravelly bark demanding tickets she did not possess. Hiding in the corner was no longer an option. Her gaze swept the car again, this time with a desperate, calculating purpose. She wasn't looking for kindness. She'd learned long ago that kindness was a currency she couldn't afford. She was looking for an anchor, a rock in a churning sea of men. And then she saw him. He sat alone, taking up more space than one man rightly should. He was the tallest man in the car, his shoulders broad enough to block the light from the window behind him. A long, dark leather duster, worn soft and creased with age, fell from his shoulders to his scuffed boots. A wide-brimmed hat, its crown stained with sweat and dust, was pulled low, shadowing his face in mystery. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at anyone. His gaze was fixed on the passing landscape, a blur of sagebrush and cracked earth, but his stillness suggested he wasn't truly seeing it. While the other men shifted, spat, and muttered, he was a study in absolute repose, as silent and immovable as the mesas that dotted the horizon. He was the one. The decision was not born of logic, but of pure, animal instinct. A cornered rabbit does not reason. It bolts for the deepest shadow it can find. Getting to him was an ordeal. She pushed herself up on trembling legs, her small bundle held tight against her chest like a shield. The floor swayed beneath her feet. Every eye in the car turned to follow her progress. The gambler's smile widened. A prospector grunted and shifted his legs, blocking her path for a moment before she timidly sidestepped him. Each step was a lifetime. The air grew thicker, the silence in the car louder than the rattling of the wheels. She felt their stares like physical hands, prodding and prying. She kept her chin down. Her focus narrowed to the back of the tall man's coat. It was a fortress. It had to be. When she finally stood before him, her own small shadow was consumed by his. She had to crane her neck to see under the brim of his hat. His face was all angles and planes, carved from granite and tanned by 1,000 suns. A dark, untrimmed mustache hid his upper lip, and a day's worth of stubble shadowed a jaw that looked strong enough to break stone. He still hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged her presence in any way. For a terrifying second, she thought he was asleep with his eyes open. She had to speak. The words were trapped in her throat, small, frightened things. She swallowed against the dust and the fear. Her voice, when it came, was barely a breath, a sound meant to be lost in the noise of the train. "Can I hide under your coat?" The question hung in the air between them, fragile and absurd. He didn't react. The seconds stretched, each one a small eternity. The gambler chuckled softly behind her. Ruthie's hope, a tiny, flickering candle flame, began to gutter. She was a fool, a stupid, desperate fool. She should have stayed in the corner. She should have jumped from the train. She was about to turn, to retreat back into the gauntlet of stairs. When he finally moved, it was a slow, deliberate motion. He didn't turn his head. His gaze simply shifted from the window to her face. His eyes were the color of dark, wet earth after a rain. And they held no surprise, no pity, no curiosity. They just saw. They saw the torn dress and the fear and the desperation that had propelled her across the car. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. And in that gaze, Ruthie felt as if he were reading every page of her short, wretched story. He saw the flight, the terror, the man she was running from. He saw it all, and he asked nothing. Then, with the same unhurried grace, he lifted his left arm. He took the edge of his leather duster and, in a single, fluid motion, pulled it open. He created a space beside him, a cave of shadow and worn leather. It was an invitation, offered without a single word. Relief washed over Ruthie so powerfully her knees nearly buckled. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the offered space, pressing herself against the hard warmth of his side. The world outside vanished, the leering faces, the dusty sunbeams, the rattling noise of the car. It was all gone. She was enveloped in darkness, a cocoon that smelled of leather, dust, horses, and the faint, clean scent of the man himself. She heard the soft groan of the leather as he let the coat fall back into place, cloaking her completely. His arm, solid and corded with muscle, settled around her back, not in an embrace, but as a simple, physical barrier, his large hand resting lightly on her far shoulder to hold the duster closed. It was a gesture of pure practicality, as impersonal and as profound as a locked door. Tucked into the darkness, pressed against the solid wall of his chest, Ruthie could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart. It was a rhythm of calm, of quiet strength. For the first time in days, the frantic drumming in her own chest began to slow, matching his even tempo. She was trembling, a fine, violent shudder that shook her whole frame, the delayed reaction to weeks of terror. She pressed her face against the rough fabric of his shirt, biting her lip to keep from making a sound. He remained completely still. He did not speak. He did not shift or acknowledge the trembling girl hidden against his side. He simply resumed his watch over the desolate landscape, a silent sentinel, a mountain that had offered a moment of shelter to a bird caught in a storm. The train rattled on, carrying them west, deeper into the vast, unknown emptiness. But for Ruthie, hidden in the warm, leathery darkness, it was the first time she had ever felt safe. The fragile peace inside the leather cocoon shattered not with a sound, but with a feeling. It was the sudden, rigid stillness of the man beside her. One moment, his chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm against her back. The next, he was a wall of unyielding granite. His heart, which had been a steady, lulling beat, now hammered a silent, urgent alarm against her ear. The hand holding the duster closed on her shoulder tightened, the pressure just shy of painful, a wordless command to be still. Then she heard it. Heavy, purposeful footsteps on the wooden platform between the cars. A sound distinct from the shuffling of the other passengers. A voice, coarse as gravel and loud with authority. Cut through the carriage's low din. "We're looking for something. Property of Mr. Alistair Finch." Ruthie went cold. Finch, the gunsmith. The name was a brand on her soul, and the sound of it, spoken aloud in this crowded space, was like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. A choked, terrified gasp. The man Beckett. Her mind had silently named him, seemed to feel her panic. His thumb pressed once, hard, against her shoulder blade. "Stay quiet." The carriage door slammed open, banging against its frame and making several passengers jump. 3 men filled the doorway, their shapes silhouetted against the bright, dusty light. They stood for a moment, letting their eyes adjust, their presence sucking the air from the car. "A girl," the loud one boomed. Stepping inside, he was a barrel-chested man with a florid face and a mean, small mouth. Barely a woman, ran off from her lawful husband. "Any of you fine folks seen her?" Silence. The other passengers suddenly found the passing scenery, the floorboards, the contents of their own pockets, intensely fascinating. No one wanted a part of this. The second man was thin and wiry, with eyes that darted about like a rat's. He pointed a long, dirty finger. "Check every corner. Jeb." The third man said nothing. He was tall and gaunt, his face a mask of bored cruelty. He simply leaned against the doorframe, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip, his cold eyes methodically sweeping the car. Ruthie squeezed her eyes shut, trying to shrink, to disappear into the fabric of Beckett's coat. She could hear their boots on the wooden floor, a slow, menacing tread coming closer. Jeb, the loud one, was harassing the gambler, who protested his innocence with a sudden lack of his earlier swagger. She could smell the cheap pomade and stale sweat of the rat-faced man as he passed their bench. "Please don't look, please don't see." Jeb's voice was right beside them now. "And what about you, friend? You're taking up a powerful lot of room. Seen anything unusual?" The world held its breath. Ruthie could feel the slow turn of Beckett's head as he looked up at the man standing over them. She waited for his voice, a deep rumble she had yet to hear. She prayed it would be convincing, that it would be enough. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and dangerous. It was a defiance more potent than any lie. "I asked you a question," Jeb growled, his voice dropping low. "You deaf." Ruthie felt Beckett's body shift, a subtle coiling of muscles. His hand left her shoulder. For a heart-stopping second, she thought he was going to push her out, to give her up. Instead, his fingers brushed the side of her head, a whisper-light touch that seemed to say, "Get ready." Through the smallest gap in the coat, she saw him raise his other hand slowly, pushing back the brim of his hat just enough to reveal his eyes. He leveled a gaze at Jeb that was as flat and deadly as a winter sky. And then, chaos. In a single, explosive movement, Beckett was on his feet, one arm hooking around Ruthie's waist and pulling her with him. He didn't go toward the men. He lunged for the open carriage door. "Hold on," he finally spoke, his voice a low, urgent rasp against her ear, the first and only words he'd offered. The silent man at the door was taken by surprise, stumbling back as Beckett slammed into him. Shouts erupted behind them. A hand clawed at Beckett's duster, but they were already through the door, out on the clattering, swaying platform between the cars. The wind hit them like a fist, tearing the breath from her lungs. The ground below was a terrifying, speeding blur of rock and scrub. There was no time to think, no time to scream. Beckett didn't hesitate. He pulled her tight against his side, took one more powerful step, and launched them into the void. The world became a maelstrom of wind, sun, and sand. They hit the ground hard, the impact jarring every bone in Ruthie's body. They tumbled, end over end, a chaotic tangle of limbs, leather, and torn calico. Dust and gravel filled her mouth, her nose, Her eyes. The world was grit and pain and the terrifying scrape of earth against her skin. When they finally slid to a stop, she lay stunned, the blue sky spinning violently above her. A sharp, searing pain bloomed in her left knee. She looked down and saw the torn fabric of her dress, dark and wet with a blossom of crimson. Blood, her blood. A wave of nausea and dizziness washed over her. "Up, now?" Beckett's voice was sharp, cutting through her daze. He was already on his feet, his duster covered in dust, a long scratch bleeding freely on his cheek. He paid it no mind. His eyes were fixed on the train. Now, 100 yards down the track, a black serpent shrinking against the horizon. Figures were climbing down from the carriage. Their shouts were thin and faint, carried away by the wind. They had been seen. He grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet. Her knee screamed in protest, threatening to buckle, but his grip was like iron, holding her steady. There was no time for pain. The thought was a cold, clear fact in her mind. Pain was a luxury. Survival was the only currency that mattered. He pulled her along, half running, half dragging her away from the tracks and into the broken, rocky land that stretched to the east. Every step was agony. Her leg was a dead weight, but she forced it to move, fueled by the adrenaline of pure terror. Beckett set a brutal pace, his long strides eating up the harsh terrain. He moved with a purpose she could only cling to, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape ahead, reading the folds of the earth, the placement of the rocks, the shape of the shadows. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down from a brassy sky. Sweat streamed down her face, stinging her eyes and leaving salty tracks in the grime. Her throat was a desert, her lungs burning with every ragged breath. Behind them, she could hear the occasional shout of their pursuers. Closer now. They were being tracked. Beckett suddenly veered to the right, pulling her down into a shallow, dry wash. The sand was deep here, slowing them down but hiding their tracks. He led her along its winding path until it ended at a sheer wall of sun-baked rock. It looked like a dead end. Ruthie's heart sank, but Beckett didn't stop. He ran his hand along the rock face until he found what he was looking for, a narrow, vertical fissure, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, hidden in the deep shadows of an overhang. He pushed her toward it, inside. She scrambled in, the rough stone scraping her arms. The space was tight, suffocating. It smelled of hot rock and ancient dust. Beckett followed her in, pressing himself against the back wall, then pulling her in front of him, shielding her body with his own. They were completely hidden from view. They stood in the sweltering darkness, chests heaving, the sound of their own frantic breathing loud in the enclosed space. Outside, the world was silent for a moment, save for the buzz of a lone fly and the vast, empty hum of the desert. Then, voices. Close. "Spread out, they can't have gone far." It was Jeb's angry bellow. The scuff of boots on gravel. They were right outside the rock face. Ruthie held her breath, her body rigid with terror. She could feel Beckett's absolute stillness behind her, a living statue of patience and coiled tension. "Ain't nothing this way but rock," the rat-faced man whined, probably doubled back toward the riverbed. "Maybe," Jeb grunted. A stone clattered nearby, as if kicked by a careless foot. "Still, you and Silas check that ridge. I'll follow this wash a ways more. Fire a shot if you see him." The footsteps separated. Two sets went one way, one set the other. They listened as the sounds faded into the distance, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. They waited. 5 minutes. 10. Ruthie's muscles screamed with the effort of staying still. Just when she thought they were safe, Beckett moved. He slid out of the crevice as silently as a shadow. "Stay here," he whispered, his eyes already scanning their surroundings. Before she could protest, he was gone, moving in a low crouch in the opposite direction from where the men had gone. She was alone. The fear, held at bay by his presence, came rushing back. The crevice felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. Every gust of wind sounded like returning footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Minutes crawled by like wounded animals. Where had he gone? Had he abandoned her? Just as a new wave of despair began to wash over her, a thin plume of gray smoke began to rise in the distance. Far to the south, downwind from their position, it was a small, almost insignificant wisp against the vast sky, but it was deliberate. A signal. A moment later, a triumphant shout echoed from the north. "There's smoke. They've made a fire." The sound of running footsteps followed, heading away from her, toward the false signal. He had drawn them off. He had created a decoy. It was almost another quarter of an hour before he reappeared at the mouth of the fissure, his face grim, his eyes clear. He carried the scent of sage and smoke. He said nothing, simply extended a hand to her. She took it, his calloused palm enveloping her own, and let him pull her out into the blinding sunlight. He led her away from the crevice, into a maze of canyons and arroyos she never would have navigated on her own. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. Her knee was a throbbing, relentless agony, and she stumbled often. Each time, his grip on her arm tightened, holding her up, propelling her forward. He was relentless, a man driven by a singular purpose she could not yet fathom. They walked on into the deepening twilight, a silent man and a broken girl, moving deeper into a dry, forgotten valley that held the promise of a place he called home. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky when they finally stopped walking. Ruthie had long since lost all sense of time and direction. The world had shrunk to the rhythmic crunch of Beckett's boots on the dry earth, the steady, unyielding grip of his hand on her arm, and the fire in her knee that had burned down to a dull, throbbing coal of misery. Her body was an automaton, moving only because it was being pulled, her mind a numb, gray fog. He led her through a final, narrow gap between two looming rock formations, and the landscape changed. The wind, which had been a constant, harrying presence, suddenly softened. The air grew still, and the sharp scent of dust was tempered by the cooler, greener smell of juniper and cottonwood. They had entered a small, sheltered valley, a cupped hand of land hidden from the vast, indifferent plains. And there, nestled against the base of a low mesa, was a home. It wasn't a grand place. It was a small cabin, built of sturdy, dark logs chinked with pale mud, looking as if it had grown from the earth itself. A low-slung roof of sod offered insulation against the brutal sun and the cold nights. A thin curl of smoke, almost invisible against the star-dusted sky, rose from a stone chimney. Beside the cabin stood a small, rough-looking barn and a corral, its fences stark, dark lines in the moonlight. A water pump stood like a lone, skeletal sentinel. The entire homestead was bathed in a profound and settled silence. It was a place of solitude, a world unto itself. As they approached, a soft, yellow rectangle of light appeared as the cabin door swung inward. A figure stood framed in the opening, small and still. For a heart-stopping moment, Ruthie's terror flared anew. Had they been followed? Was this a trap? But this was no threat. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old, small for his age, with a shock of dark hair that fell into his eyes. He was dressed in a simple homespun shirt and trousers that were slightly too big for him. He held a small, flickering lantern, and in its warm, unsteady glow, his face was solemn and watchful. He looked at the towering figure of Beckett, then his gaze shifted to Ruthie, clinging to the man's side like a burr. He took in her torn, filthy dress, the matted state of her hair, and the way she favored her left leg. His eyes, dark and serious like Beckett's, showed no fear, no alarm, only a deep, unnerving curiosity. He simply watched them come, a silent, miniature gatekeeper to this hidden world. Beckett didn't speak as he led her past the boy and over the threshold. The air inside was warm and smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something clean, like soap. The interior was as simple and unadorned as the outside. A single large room served as the living space, a stone fireplace, its embers glowing a soft, welcoming red, dominated one wall. A sturdy table, scrubbed nearly white, stood in the center of the room, flanked by 2 chairs. Against the far wall was a cooking stove and shelves holding a spare assortment of tin plates, cups, and cast-iron pans. Everything was meticulously ordered. A place for everything and everything in its place. It was the sparest room she had ever seen, yet it felt more like a home than any place she had ever known. Beckett released her arm. The sudden absence of his support made her sway, and she instinctively reached out, her hand landing on the back of one of the chairs to steady herself. He moved past her without a word, taking the lantern from the boy and placing it on the table. The light spread, chasing the deeper shadows into the corners of the room. The boy, whose name she still didn't know, closed the door behind them. The soft thud of the wood shutting out the vast, dangerous night. Ruthie stood frozen by the chair, her small cloth bundle still clutched to her chest. She felt like an intruder, a stray animal that had wandered into the wrong den. She was a creature of chaos and fear. And this place was the antithesis of all that. It was a bubble of profound calm. She waited for the questions, for the interrogation. She braced herself for the anger at the trouble she had brought to his doorstep, for the demand to know who she was and what she was running from. Her entire life had taught her that nothing was free, that shelter and safety always came at a price, and she waited for the bill to be presented. Beckett walked to the fireplace and used a poker to stir the embers, coaxing a small flame to life before adding another log. The wood caught with a soft crackle and hiss. The boy moved to the stove, took a tin cup from a hook, and filled it with water from a bucket. He brought the cup to the table and set it down on her side. A simple, silent offering. He didn't look at her as he did it, but she felt his awareness of her in the careful way he placed it just within her reach. Then he retreated to a small stool by the hearth, pulling a worn wooden horse from his pocket and running his thumb over its smooth, carved surface. Beckett finally turned from the fire. He looked at her, his gaze as unreadable as it had been on the train. He saw her standing there, filthy, bleeding, and trembling with exhaustion. A wild thing brought to ground. He saw the terror that still lurked behind her eyes. He must have seen 1,000 questions in her posture, in the desperate way she held herself together. He addressed none of them. He simply inclined his head toward the stove. His voice, when it came, was the same low, practical rasp she'd heard just before they jumped from the train. It was a voice that wasted no breath. "If you're hungry, the kitchen's on the left." The words were so simple, so utterly unexpected, that they failed to register for a moment. She stared at him, uncomprehending. He wasn't asking if she was hungry. He was stating a fact and providing a solution, leaving the choice entirely, impossibly, up to her. There was no demand, no expectation, no suspicion, just a quiet acknowledgement of a basic human need. She could only shake her head, a small, jerky movement. The thought of food was impossible. Her stomach was a tight, acid knot of fear and pain. He gave a single, accepting nod. He looked at the boy. "Lem, time for bed." The boy, Lem, looked up. He gave Ruthie one last, long, curious look before nodding and disappearing through one of the 2 doors that led off the main room. Beckett then walked to a shelf near the door and took down a small wooden box. From it, he pulled a clean strip of cloth and a dark brown bottle. He brought them to the table, along with a bucket of water and a small basin. He gestured to the chair. "Sit." It was a command, but it was spoken without heat. It was the same tone one might use with a spooked horse. She obeyed numbly, sinking into the chair, her body screaming in protest. He knelt before her, his large frame making the simple furniture seem small. He didn't ask permission. He gently took hold of the hem of her torn dress and ripped the soiled fabric away from her knee, his movements economical and sure. The wound was ugly in the lamplight, a raw, swollen scrape caked with dried blood and dirt. She flinched, expecting a sharp, reprimanding touch, but his hands were surprisingly gentle as he poured water into the basin and soaked the cloth. He cleaned the wound with a slow, methodical patience, his focus absolute. She watched the top of his head, the way his dark hair curled slightly over the collar of his shirt. He never looked at her face. He just tended to the injury, a task to be completed. When it was clean, he uncorked the bottle. The sharp, clean scent of whiskey filled the air. "This will sting," he said. It was not an apology, but a statement of fact. He poured a small amount directly onto the wound. Fire! A white-hot, searing flame shot up her leg, and a strangled gasp escaped her lips. Her hands clenched into fists on the tabletop. He didn't pause, simply took the clean cloth and began to wrap her knee, his movements firm and efficient. When he was done, the bandage was neat and secure. He rose to his feet, taking the dirty water and cloth with him. He disposed of them, then returned to the hearth. Taking the stool that Lem had vacated, he sat there, staring into the flames, his back to her. The matter was finished. Ruthie sat at the table, her leg throbbing with a clean, antiseptic fire. She looked around the quiet room, at the boy's wooden horse, left on the hearth, at the neat stack of tin plates, at the silent man staring into the fire, a man who had asked for nothing, not even her name. No one wanted anything from her. The thought was so revolutionary, so profoundly alien, that it made her head spin. Her entire existence had been a series of transactions. Her father had sold her to settle a debt. Alistair Finch had seen her as property to be owned and used. The men on the train had looked at her with hungry, speculative eyes. She had always been something to be taken, a commodity. But here, in this silent, hidden cabin, she was simply present, a person, a girl with a wounded knee. Her past was a ghost that had not been invited over the threshold. Her future was a blank, terrifying page. But in this single, suspended moment, she was asked for nothing. She was required to be nothing. She simply existed, and that existence was accepted without question or comment. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or fear, or even relief. It was a tear of sheer, overwhelming bewilderment. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand, her movements furtive, as if the quiet itself might be broken by the display of emotion. Beckett gave no sign that he had noticed. He just continued to watch the fire, a silent, immovable mountain in the heart of the storm, offering a shelter she had never known existed. Sleep, when it finally came, was a black, dreamless pit of exhaustion. Ruthie woke not to a sound, but to a subtle shift in the quality of the light. A pale, silvery dawn was filtering through a small, square window set high in the wall of her room, illuminating a space as sparse and unyielding as the man who had brought her to it. There was only a narrow cot, a three-legged stool, and a single nail driven into the log wall for hanging her meager bundle. The air was cold and still. For a moment, she was adrift, unsure of where she was. Then memory returned in a brutal, rushing tide. The train, the shouting men, the desperate leap, the agonizing flight across the desert. Her body ached with a deep, comprehensive soreness, and her bandaged knee throbbed with a dull, insistent rhythm. She sat up, her movements stiff, and pushed aside the single, coarse blanket. The silence of the cabin was absolute. It was a living thing, a presence that was both unnerving and strangely calming after the constant, grinding noise of the train. Hesitantly, she made her way into the main room. It was empty. The fire had been banked, its embers glowing softly in the hearth. A tin coffee pot sat on the stove, and 2 plates, wiped clean, were stacked neatly by the wash basin. Beckett and Lem were gone, already swallowed up by the day's work. They had moved with a quiet efficiency that had left no trace, like ghosts who called this place home. A wave of uselessness washed over her. She was a burden, a mouth to feed, a liability that had brought violence and danger to this quiet doorstep. She couldn't just sit here, waiting. Idleness was a poison, allowing the fear and the memories to fester and grow. She had to do something, anything, to prove she was more than just the trouble she carried. The room, though sparse, was clean, but she set about tidying it with a nervous energy. She straightened the 2 chairs at the table, smoothed a non-existent wrinkle in the blanket on Beckett's empty cot, and swept the already clean floorboards with a makeshift broom she found by the door. They were small, meaningless tasks, but they were an anchor. They were work. Her gaze fell on the wash basin. Beckett's skillet, heavy and black, sat beside it, along with the coffee pot. This, at least, was a task with purpose. She pushed up the sleeves of her dress, the worn fabric stiff and foreign against her skin. It was the only dress she had, and the thought of what she would do when it finally fell apart was a dark cloud she pushed to the edge of her mind. She worked the pump outside, the rhythmic squeak and groan of the handle a comfortingly solid sound in the morning stillness. The water was shockingly cold, and she carried the heavy bucket back inside, her sore knee protesting with every step. She heated the water on the stove, the warmth a small comfort against the morning chill. The soap was a hard lye block that smelled of ash and fat, but it lathered in her hands. She scrubbed the skillet with a fierce determination, scraping away the last remnants of Beckett and Lem's breakfast. It felt good to be useful, to impose a small bit of order on a world that had been nothing but chaos. It felt good to have her hands immersed in something as simple and honest as hot water. She was so absorbed in her task, in the simple, repetitive motion of washing and rinsing, that she didn't hear him return. The cabin door was built well, swinging on oiled leather hinges, and Beckett moved with the silence of a man who lived his life trying not to disturb the world around him. One moment, she was alone, and the next, he was there, standing just inside the threshold, his large frame filling the doorway. Ruthie gasped, a small, startled sound, and spun around, her heart hammered against her ribs. A wild bird trapped in a cage, old fear, primal and deeply ingrained, shot through her. A man, appearing suddenly and silently, her body tensed, ready to bolt, to fight, to make herself small. He held up a hand, a placating gesture, though his face remained impassive. "Forgot the whetstone," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't move further into the room, just stood by the door, giving her space. Her panic slowly subsided, replaced by a flush of embarrassment. She was acting like a spooked doe. She turned back to the basin, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up a tin plate. "I was just cleaning up," she murmured, her voice thin and unsteady. "I see that," he said. He still hadn't moved. He was watching her, his gaze steady. She tried to ignore him, to focus on the plate in her hands, but she could feel his eyes on her. It wasn't a prying or judgmental look. It was just watchful. As she reached for the soap, her wrist twisted in the pale morning light. The long sleeve of her dress, damp from the water, had clung to her arm, pulling back just an inch. It was enough. There, on the delicate, blue-veined skin just below her wrist, was the faint, mottled shadow of a bruise. It was old, yellowing at the edges, the ghost of fingers that had gripped her too tightly, a permanent, ugly reminder of ownership and control, a brand left by Alistair Finch. His gaze fell upon it. She saw the fractional, almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. It was not a look of shock or pity. It was a look of quiet, grim recognition. He had seen marks like that before, on spooked horses and on men broken in barroom brawls. It was the mark of a bully, the signature of cruelty. Instinct, faster than thought, took over. She flinched as if she'd been struck, yanking her hand back from the light and pulling her sleeve down with a frantic, jerky motion. She cradled her arm against her chest, turning her body away from him, trying to hide the evidence that was written on her own skin. The plate slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered into the basin, the sound deafeningly loud in the silent room. Shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. He had seen her weakness, her shame, the proof that she was damaged goods. He would cast her out now. He would see her not as a person, but as a problem, a piece of used-up trouble that had washed up on his shore. Her voice, when she spoke, was a ragged whisper, directed at the floorboards, at the water in the basin, at anyone but the silent man by the door. "I have nothing left." It was the truest thing she had ever said. It wasn't about the little bundle in her room, or the dress on her back. It was a confession of the soul. They had taken everything, her home, her future, her dignity. They had stripped her down to nothing but fear and memory. She was empty. She had nothing to offer, nothing to give in exchange for the kindness he had shown her. She was a hollowed-out thing. The silence that followed stretched for an eternity. She braced herself for his response, for the cold dismissal, the weary sigh, the quiet instruction to be on her way. Instead, his voice came, low and soft, from across the room. It was not a voice of pity, but of profound, unshakable certainty. "That's enough." 2 words. They landed in the shattered landscape of her heart, not like a command, but like a foundation stone being laid. Not, "It's enough," but "That's enough." The emptiness you carry, the nothing you have to offer, the person you are, right now, with all your scars and all your fear, that is sufficient. She risked a glance at him over her shoulder. He was still watching her, his dark, earthy eyes holding hers, and in them, she saw no judgment. She saw only a quiet, solemn acceptance that was more healing than any words of comfort could ever be. He understood that she wasn't just talking about money or possessions. He understood the true nature of her confession, and his response was a balm she hadn't known she so desperately needed. The moment hung between them, fragile and intensely private. Then, as if sensing he had pushed as far as he could, as far as she could bear, he gave a slight nod. He picked up the small, smooth stone from the shelf by the door, turned without another word, and left the cabin, his footsteps receding into the vast silence outside. Ruthie stood at the basin for a long time, her hands submerged in the now tepid water, his words echoing in the quiet room. "That's enough." She finished the dishes with methodical, deliberate movements, her hands still trembling, but for a different reason now. They did not touch after that. An invisible line had been drawn, a boundary of respect around her pain. He seemed to understand that physical contact, even the brush of a hand, was a complication she could not handle. But the silence between them began to change. It was no longer just an absence of words, but a space filled with a new, unspoken understanding. The next morning, when she emerged from her room, a tin cup of water sat on the table, a faint plume of steam rising from its surface. It was not coffee, which would have felt like an expectation to join in his routine. It was just warm water, a simple, gentle offering against the morning cold. He was already gone, but the evidence of his quiet consideration remained. That night, a deeper chill settled over the valley as the sun went down. She lay on her cot, curled beneath a thin blanket, shivering slightly. The cabin was silent. Beckett and Lem had long since retired to their own rooms. Sometime in the deep stillness of the night, she heard a faint shuffling sound outside her door, so soft she thought she might have imagined it. But in the morning, when she opened the door, a thick, heavy wool blanket, smelling faintly of cedar and wood smoke, was folded neatly on the floor. She picked it up, the weight of it a comfort in her arms. He had not knocked. He had not offered it to her directly, forcing a gratitude she would have struggled to express. He had simply left it there, a silent, practical provision against the cold, a shield offered without a word. She stood in the doorway, the rough wool clutched to her chest, and looked out at the quiet, empty room. Every morning, a cup of warm water. Every night, an extra blanket at her door. They were small things, almost invisible, but in the desolate, silent landscape of Ruthie's life, they were everything. They were a language she was slowly, tentatively, beginning to understand. The days settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm, marked not by the hands of a clock, but by the slow, deliberate journey of the sun across the vast, blue canvas of the sky. The terror that had been Ruthie's constant companion began to recede, its sharp edges worn smooth by the steady, metronomic pulse of life in the hidden valley. The world, which had been a place of constant, imminent threat, shrank to the manageable boundaries of the homestead, the sturdy log cabin, the weathered barn, the dusty corral, and the whispering grove of cottonwoods that lined the creek bed. Her mornings began in the chicken coop, a small, warm structure that smelled of hay and earth. The hens would cluck and mutter around her feet as she reached into the nesting boxes, her fingers searching for the smooth, warm treasures they had left. Each egg she collected was a small miracle, a perfect, tangible piece of life. She would carry them back to the cabin in the basket Beckett had left for her, her steps careful, her heart filled with a quiet sense of purpose. She was contributing, adding to the larder, no longer just a mouth to feed but a pair of hands that could help. She discovered a small sewing kit in a wooden box on a high shelf, a needlebook filled with rusted needles and spools of faded, precious thread. She took it upon herself to mend Lem's clothes. The boy was hard on his trousers, constantly returning with new rips in the knees from his solitary explorations. She would sit in the afternoon sunlight that slanted through the cabin's open door, the rough fabric of his trousers in her lap, her stitches small and neat. It was intimate work, handling the clothes that clung to their bodies, repairing the damage wrought by their hard lives. She mended a tear in the shoulder of one of Beckett's work shirts, the chambray worn soft as butter from 1,000 washings. She ran her fingers over the faded blue fabric, imagining the powerful shoulders that filled it, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in her chest. Beckett remained a figure in the middle distance, a constant, silent presence that defined the landscape of her days. She would watch him from the cabin window as he mended the fences at the far end of the pasture. He worked with a powerful, economic grace, his movements never wasted. The rhythmic thud of the post driver was a steady, reassuring beat in the afternoon quiet. He was a man who built things, who maintained boundaries, who imposed order on the wildness of the land. He was doing for his fences what he had done for her, creating a safe enclosure in a dangerous world. Sometimes she would see him on horseback, his tall frame moving as one with a powerful animal beneath him. He would ride out at dawn to check on his small herd of cattle that grazed in the higher meadows, a dark, solitary silhouette against a sky painted in shades of rose and gold. He seemed most himself out there, a man perfectly suited to the vast, empty spaces, his silence a conversation with the land itself. Lem was the quiet bridge between them. He would often sit with her as she worked, not speaking, but simply sharing the space. He would whittle on a piece of soft wood with a small, dull knife Beckett had given him, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes he would bring her things he had found on his wanderings, a hawk's feather, a strangely shaped stone, a handful of wild berries. He would present them to her without a word, his small hand outstretched, his serious eyes watching her face for a reaction. She would accept his gifts with a smile, a genuine, unforced expression that still felt new on her lips. And from across the yard, Beckett would sometimes pause in his work, his gaze resting on them for a long moment, a stillness in his posture that she was beginning to recognize as a form of attention. The valley bloomed under the spring sun, The dry brown earth sprouted a carpet of tender green grass, tiny, vibrant wildflowers, purple, yellow, and a startling brilliant blue poked their heads up between the rocks. The air grew thick with the scent of sage and damp earth, and the creek, which had been a mere trickle, now ran full and clear with melted snow from the distant mountains. A new season was upon them, a season of quiet growth. The storm arrived one afternoon with a sudden, dramatic violence. The sky, which had been a placid, cloudless blue, turned a bruised, greenish gray. The wind rose from a whisper to a howl, whipping through the cottonwoods and tearing at the sod roof of the cabin. Then the rain came, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered against the world, blurring the edges of the mountains and turning the dusty yard into a sea of churning mud. Ruthie and Lem were safe inside, the cabin a sturdy refuge against the storm's fury. Lem sat by the fire, calmly carving his bit of wood, while Ruthie watched the deluge from the window. She saw Beckett running from the pasture, his hat pulled low, his duster whipping around him as he drove the horses into the relative shelter of the barn. She expected him to follow them inside, to wait out the storm, but he didn't. A moment later, he emerged from the barn, his duster and hat left behind. He had taken off his shirt, and his back and shoulders gleamed, slick with rain, in the gray light. He was carrying a hammer and a small sack of nails. A section of the barn roof near the peak had been torn loose by the wind, the wooden shingles flapping wildly, threatening to fly off completely and expose the precious winter hay to the soaking rain. He climbed the ladder on the side of the barn with a fluid, animal grace. He moved across the steep, slippery roof as if he were walking on flat ground, his bare feet finding purchase on the wet wood. Ruthie watched, her breath held tight in her chest, as he knelt at the peak and began to work. The wind tore at him, and the rain sluiced over him in silvery waves. But he seemed oblivious. He was a man locked in a battle with the elements, a raw, primal force of nature himself. She watched the play of muscles in his back and shoulders as he braced himself and swung the hammer. The sharp, metallic sound of the blows almost lost in the roar of the wind and rain. Water streamed down his face, plastering his dark hair to his skull. He was no longer the quiet, immovable mountain of her perception. He was something more elemental, more vulnerable, more intensely alive than she had ever seen him. An impulse, sharp and undeniable, seized her. She couldn't just stand by and watch. She turned from the window and grabbed a thick, dry towel from the hook by the stove. "Stay here," she told Lem, her voice louder than she intended, trying to be heard over the storm. She pulled the cabin door open and plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind and rain hit her with a physical force, stealing her breath and soaking her thin dress in an instant. The mud sucked at her worn shoes as she ran across the yard toward the barn, the dry towel clutched to her chest like a shield. He was climbing down the ladder as she reached it. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his focus on his footing. He dropped the last few feet to the ground, landing with a soft thud in the mud. He ran a hand over his face, wiping the water from his eyes, and then he saw her. He froze. He stared at her as if she were an apparition, standing there in the heart of the storm, her hair plastered to her face, her dress clinging to her thin frame, holding out a towel. Surprise, raw and unguarded, flickered in his dark eyes. She took a hesitant step forward, extending the towel to him. "You'll catch your death," she said, the words ridiculously inadequate, almost carried away by the wind. He looked from her face to the towel and then back again. He didn't move for a long second. Then, slowly, he raised his hand to take it. His fingers, cold and wet from the rain, brushed against hers. The calluses on his palm were rough against her skin. It was a simple, fleeting contact, but a jolt, sharp and warm as lightning, shot up her arm. His hand closed over hers, stopping before he took the towel. He didn't let go. His thumb rested on the back of her hand, a small point of stillness and warmth in the cold, swirling chaos of the storm. The touch lingered. It was no longer than a few seconds, but it stretched, pulling time thin until it was a single, resonant note. He lifted his gaze from their joined hands to her face. His eyes, usually so guarded and distant, were dark and deep and startlingly close. In their earthy depths, she saw the rain, the storm, and something else. Something she had never seen there before. A question, a recognition, a flicker of heat that had nothing to do with the fire in the cabin. The world narrowed to the few inches of space between their faces, to the sound of the rain, to the impossible, undeniable warmth of his hand on hers. Her heart, which had been pounding from her run across the yard, now beat with a new, strange and terrifying rhythm. She could not look away. She felt as if he were seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time. Not as a refugee, not as a burden, but as a woman, standing before him in the rain. Then, as slowly as he had taken it, he released her hand, his fingers sliding away, taking the towel with them. The spell was broken. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. He turned and walked into the barn, leaving her standing alone in the downpour, the ghost of his touch still burning on her skin. She stood there for a long moment, rain and something warmer than rain on her cheeks, until the cold finally drove her back to the shelter of the cabin. The days that followed the storm were filled with a crystalline clarity. The rain had washed the dust from the air, and the valley seemed to hum with a new and vibrant life. A quiet, shimmering awareness now existed between Ruthie and Beckett. The air in the small cabin was charged with the memory of their shared glance, of the brief, startling touch of their hands. They moved around each other with a new, careful grace, a silent acknowledgement that some invisible boundary had been crossed and the landscape of their quiet existence had been irrevocably altered. A glance held a fraction of a second too long, a shared moment of stillness as they passed in the narrow doorway. These were the small, significant markers of a changing season. The warmth of early summer settled over the homestead, draping the afternoons in a lazy, golden haze. One such afternoon, with the day's essential chores completed, Ruthie sat on the top step of the porch, watching Lem trying to coax a tune from a simple blade of grass held between his thumbs. He produced a surprisingly loud, buzzing whistle that made a nearby lizard dart for cover. He saw her watching, and a rare, boyish pride lit his usually solemn face. He scrambled up the steps and sat beside her. "You know how?" he asked, holding the blade of grass out to her as if it were a great treasure. Ruthie shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "No, I don't believe I ever learned." "It ain't hard," he said with the unshakable confidence of a 7-year-old. "Beckett taught me. You just gotta hold it tight. Like this." He positioned a fresh blade of grass between her thumbs, his small, serious fingers pressing hers into the correct position. "Now blow. Hard." Ruthie put her hands to her lips and blew. A soft, pathetic sputtering of air was her only reward. Lem giggled, a bright, bubbling sound that was rare and wonderful. "No, not like that," he instructed patiently. "You gotta make your mouth real small and blow from your belly." She tried again, concentrating fiercely, her cheeks puffing out. This time, she managed a faint, wheezing squeak that sounded less like a whistle and more like a dying mouse. The sound was so ridiculous that a laugh escaped her. It started as a small, hesitant sound, rusty from disuse, but Lem's infectious giggles fanned the spark into a flame. Soon, she was laughing fully, her shoulders shaking, her head thrown back, the sound echoing in the quiet afternoon. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated delight, a sound she thought had been permanently stolen from her. It was the sound of a long frozen river finally breaking free. From across the yard, where he was mending a bridle in the shade of the barn, Beckett looked up. He had been a quiet, peripheral presence, as always. But the sound of her laughter drew his complete attention. He went still, the leather strap and all forgotten in his hands. He watched her, his expression unreadable from that distance. Ruthie, catching his eye, felt her laughter falter for a second, a flicker of old self-consciousness returning. She expected him to turn away, to dismiss her moment of levity with his usual stoicism, but he didn't. Instead, something remarkable happened. The stern, unyielding line of his mouth softened. The corners of his lips, usually turned down in a permanent expression of grim neutrality, began to lift. A slow, quiet smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh, weathered features into something entirely new. It wasn't a wide, toothy grin, but a gentle, profound curving of his mouth that reached all the way to his eyes, crinkling the sun-worn skin at their corners. It was a smile that held the warmth of the afternoon sun, a smile of such unexpected and startling tenderness that it made Ruthie's breath catch in her throat. For the first time, she saw the man behind the unbreachable fortress of silence. She saw a kindness, a gentleness that he kept hidden from the world. The sight of it was more intimate than his touch in the rain, a silent confession that her happiness, her moment of simple, uncomplicated joy, was something he valued. The laughter died in her throat, replaced by a quiet, profound sense of wonder. They held each other's gaze across the sun-drenched yard, and in that shared, smiling silence, the last of the winter chill finally melted from her heart. The next day, she walked out into the meadow, her mind still replaying the memory of his smile. She felt light, as if some heavy, invisible burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The world seemed brighter, the colors of the wildflowers more intense. She bent and picked a single, perfect Indian paintbrush, its fiery red-orange petals a splash of vibrant color against the green grass. It was a small, beautiful, living thing, a token of the new hope that was blooming within her. She didn't know what to do with it. Giving it to him directly felt too bold, a gesture too forward for their wordless world. Instead, when she returned to the cabin, she tucked the stem of the flower into a small crevice between the logs of the porch wall, right next to the door where he would be sure to see it. It was a quiet, anonymous offering, a small splash of beauty left for the world, or perhaps for just one person to see. She said nothing about it. All evening, she was acutely aware of the flower, a silent, colorful witness to their quiet dinner. Beckett gave no sign that he had noticed it. The next morning, when she stepped onto the porch, her heart sank a little. The flower was gone. The wind must have taken it, or perhaps it had simply been brushed away and discarded as a piece of stray foliage. She pushed aside the small pang of disappointment and went inside to start the morning chores. And then she saw it. On the table, next to his clean plate, lay his small, leather-bound notebook. It was the book he sometimes wrote in late at night by the light of the lamp, its pages filled with his neat, spare script notes on cattle, weather, and supplies. She assumed. The book was closed, but peeking out from between two pages, like a secret, was the single, crushed, fiery petal of her wildflower. He hadn't discarded it. He had saved it. He had taken her small, fleeting gift and pressed it between the pages of his private book, preserving it, making it a permanent part of his world. A wave of warmth washed over her, so powerful it made her dizzy. He had heard her silent message, and he had answered in a language she was just beginning to understand. A new ritual began, a silent conversation spoken through small, simple objects. A few days later, she found a gift waiting for her in the same spot where she had left the flower. It was a pair of eating utensils, whittled from a pale, smooth piece of cottonwood. They were not forks or spoons, but two perfectly matched, slender sticks, sanded so smooth they felt like polished stone against her fingertips. It was a gift of time, of patient, skillful hands. She knew she had to answer. The following week, she spent an entire afternoon working on one of the battered tin cups. She scoured it with fine sand from the creek bed, rubbing and polishing until the dull, scratched metal gleamed with a soft, silvery light, reflecting her own face in its distorted surface. That evening, she left it on the table next to his notebook, a silent offering of care and domesticity. The next week, a small, perfectly shaped stone appeared on the sill of her bedroom window. It was a simple piece of river rock, but it had been worn smooth by the water into the unmistakable shape of a heart. It was a gift not of skill, but of perception, of an eye that was willing to search for beauty and meaning in the common things of the world. And so it continued, a weekly, unspoken exchange of small, humble treasures. A bird's feather of an impossible, iridescent blue, a small, intricately woven ring made from sweetgrass, a biscuit baked with a handful of precious, hoarded berries, left to cool on the hearth. Each object was a word in a sentence, a line in a poem they were writing together. They never spoke of it. The gifts were never acknowledged with a thank you or a nod. They were simply left and found and understood. Their quiet, solitary lives were becoming intertwined, their stories slowly weaving together, thread by silent, brightly colored thread. The cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It was becoming a home, filled not with words, but with a quiet and steadily growing love. The long, slow twilight of summer settled over the valley, painting the sky in soft, bruised shades of lavender and rose. The day's heat lingered in the baked earth, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and the drowsy hum of evening insects. Inside the cabin, a quiet, domestic peace reigned. Dinner was over, a simple meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, and Lem, his eyelids heavy, had been sent to his cot. The world had shrunk to the four walls of the cabin, to the small circle of warm, yellow light cast by the oil lamp on the table. In the week since the wildflower, the silence between Ruthie and Beckett had transformed. It was no longer an absence of sound, but a language in its own right, a comfortable, shared space woven from mutual respect and 1,000 unspoken kindnesses. But tonight, a different kind of quiet had fallen between them. It was a silence that was not empty, but full, a silence that hummed with a low, resonant tension, like a plucked string waiting to vibrate. The knowledge of what was to come, of what was now possible between them, hung in the warm air. It was in the way his eyes had lingered on her as she'd served the stew, in the way she'd felt her skin flush when his arm had brushed hers as he reached for the water jug. The small, safe world they had built, with its careful boundaries and silent gifts, was trembling on the brink of a profound and terrifying change. And Ruthie knew, with a certainty that was a cold knot of dread in her stomach, that she could not let it change without speaking the truth. Her past was a locked room, a dark and shameful secret she had carried into his clean, quiet home. The gentle affection growing between them was built on a foundation of silence, and she feared it was a lie. He saw her as a survivor, a girl he had pulled from the dust, but he did not know the whole of it. He did not know the true nature of the fear that still, in her darkest moments, held her in its icy grip. She stood at the wash basin, her back to him, her hands plunged into the hot, soapy water. The familiar, mundane task was a shield, something to do with her hands while her mind raced. He was sitting at the table, sharpening a knife with long, steady strokes of a whetstone, the rhythmic shk, shk, shk of steel on stone, the only sound in the room. It was a sound of patience, of order, of a man setting his world right, and she was about to bring her chaos into it. Her hands trembled in the water. She scrubbed at a plate with a ferocity it did not require, the rough cloth scraping against the tin. She had to tell him, before the unspoken question in his eyes became a touch, before the gentle warmth between them could be consumed by a misunderstanding. She owed him the truth. More than that, she owed it to herself. To speak the fear aloud was the only way to rob it of its power. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of lye soap and wood smoke filling her lungs. She did not turn around. She couldn't. She would shatter into 1,000 pieces if she had to see his face, to witness his reaction. She fixed her gaze on the distorted reflection of the lamp in the dark, wet window pane above the basin. Her voice, when it came, was so soft it was nearly lost in the sound of the whetstone. It was a thread of a sound, frayed and fragile. "I am a virgin." The rhythmic scraping of the whetstone stopped. The silence that descended was absolute. It was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She could hear the faint hiss of the oil lamp, the frantic, terrified thumping of her own heart against her ribs. She kept her hands submerged in the hot water, gripping the edge of the basin until her knuckles were white, as if the solid wood and hot water were the only things keeping her from dissolving into nothingness. She waited. For what, she did not know. Disgust, pity. A cold, weary dismissal. She had offered him the most vulnerable, most private part of herself, a truth that, in her experience, men either coveted with a rough hunger or dismissed as a complication. She heard the soft scrape of his chair against the floorboards. Her entire body went rigid. He was getting up. He was going to walk away, to leave her alone with her shameful, clumsy confession. But the footsteps were not moving away. They were coming closer. A slow, deliberate tread. 1 step. 2. He stopped directly behind her. She could feel his presence, a solid wall of warmth at her back. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of him, of leather and sun and wind. But he did not touch her. He just stood there, a silent mountain in the small, lamp-lit room. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. She had to fill it. She had to explain. He had to understand that her words were not an invitation or a boast. They were a plea. They were the name of her deepest terror. She spoke again, her voice a raw, broken whisper, directed at her own wavering reflection in the dark glass. It was less a statement and more an apology. "Treat a virgin gently." The words were a prayer, a desperate appeal to the quiet, steady man who stood behind her. Don't be like the others. Don't be like Finch, whose imagined touch was a violation, whose voice was the sound of a cage door slamming shut. Don't let your strength be a weapon. Please, be the man I have come to believe you are. Behind her, she heard him draw in a long, slow breath. The sound was steady, measured. He was not shocked. He was not angry. He was considering. He was taking her fear, her fragile, whispered plea, and weighing it with the same solemn gravity with which he weighed every other important thing in his world. The wait for his response was the longest moment of her life. The world seemed to hang suspended, balanced on the point of a pin, waiting for his voice to either save her or shatter her completely. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, quiet rumble, so close it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up into her very bones. It was a voice stripped of all but its essential truth. It was the sound of a vow. Always. One word. It was not a promise. It was a statement of fact, a law of his own nature. It was the sun rising in the east. It was the creek flowing down from the mountains. It was who he was, and it was all she needed. A wave of relief so profound, so overwhelming, washed over her that her knees went weak. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, dripping silently into the water below. She let out a breath she hadn't even realized she was holding, a ragged, shuddering sigh. And then she felt it. A touch. It was not his whole hand. It was not a grasp or a hold. It was just the barest, lightest pressure of his 2 fingertips, calloused and warm, against the back of her wet hand as it rested on the edge of the basin. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure, unadulterated tenderness that shot up her arm and straight to the core of her being. It was the first time he had touched her with deliberate, gentle intent, not to pull her from a train, not to bandage a wound, not even the accidental, lingering touch in the rain. This was different. This was a choice. It was a conscious, physical manifestation of the word he had just spoken. It was the sealing of his vow. The touch lasted only a second, 2 at most, but in that brief, breathtaking moment, he communicated more than 1,000 pretty words ever could. He was saying, "I hear you. I understand. You are safe with me. This part of you, this fragility you fear, is not a thing to be broken, but a thing to be protected. I will be gentle." Then, as quietly as it had come, the touch was gone. He took a step back. She heard him turn and walk back to the table. The soft scraping of his chair, the quiet, rhythmic shk, shk, shk of the whetstone resumed its steady, patient work. The moment was over. The world had returned to its normal rhythm, but nothing was the same. Ruthie stood at the basin, her hand tingling where he had touched it, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the evening's quiet cataclysm. She slowly, deliberately, finished washing the last plate, her movements no longer frantic, but calm and sure. She had offered him her deepest vulnerability, and he had met it not with force, but with a quiet, unshakable vow and the gentlest of touches. She was no longer just a survivor he had rescued. She was a woman he had promised to protect, and in the quiet, lamp-lit cabin, that was enough. It was everything. The peace of the valley shattered not with a warning, but with a sudden, unnatural stillness. Beckett was at the woodpile, the axe rising and falling in a powerful, hypnotic rhythm. Then, in the middle of a swing, he stopped. The axe hung suspended in the air for a heart-stopping second before he lowered it slowly, silently, to the chopping block. He stood motionless, his head cocked, his entire being a listening instrument tuned to the subtle frequencies of the wilderness. Ruthie, who had been shaking out a rug on the porch, saw the change in him. It was the same absolute, predatory stillness she had felt on the train just before the men had burst in. A cold dread, a familiar and sickening serpent, uncoiled in the pit of her stomach. The rug slipped from her hands, landing in a dusty heap at her feet. "Lem." Beckett's voice was a low, flat command that cut through the afternoon quiet. He didn't turn, his gaze fixed on the narrow gap in the rocks that served as the valley's entrance. Inside, now, the boy, who had been sailing a leaf boat in the water trough, looked up, his face a mask of confusion. But he had been raised in a world where a man's tone was law. He didn't question. He scrambled down from the trough and ran for the cabin, his small face pale. Beckett walked to meet them on the porch, his movements fluid and unhurried, but his eyes were hard as flint, scanning the horizon. "They found us," he said. It wasn't a question or a guess. It was a statement of fact. The serpent of fear tightened its coils around Ruthie's heart, stealing her breath. Who, she whispered, though she already knew the answer. He didn't need to say the name. Instead, he moved past her into the cabin. "There's a cellar," he said, pulling up a heavy, square-cut section of the floorboards near the hearth, revealing a dark, narrow opening and a short ladder leading down into the cool, earthy blackness under the floor. "Get in, both of you. Take the lamp. Do not come out. No matter what you hear, do you understand?" He turned to a long wooden chest that sat against the far wall, a chest she had assumed held blankets or tools. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in oiled cloth, lay his weapons, a long Winchester rifle and a heavy Colt revolver. He checked the loads with an economy of motion that was both terrifying and mesmerizing to watch. He was a man preparing for a storm he had long seen gathering on the horizon. Lem was already at the edge of the opening, his small body trembling, his wide, dark eyes fixed on Beckett's face. He was frightened, but his faith in the man who was his entire world was absolute. "Go on, Lem," Beckett said, his voice softer now as he looked at the boy. He placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stay with Ruthie. Be brave." Lem nodded. A single, jerky movement, and scrambled down the ladder. disappearing into the darkness. Ruthie stood frozen. The cellar, the darkness, hiding. It was the train all over again. The instinct to shrink, to cower, to disappear into a cocoon of safety, while the man of stone and silence stood between her and the world. But something was different now. The girl who had begged to hide under a stranger's coat was gone. She had been washed away in the rain, healed by quiet kindnesses, and remade in the warmth of a shared smile. Beckett turned to her, the rifle in one hand, the revolver tucked into his belt. His face was a grim, unreadable mask. "Ruthie, go." She looked from his hard face to the dark, waiting hole in the floor. She thought of Lem, huddled in the darkness below. She thought of this man, preparing to face 3 armed men alone. For her, for the trouble she had brought to his door. And a new feeling, fierce and hot and powerful, surged through her, burning away the last vestiges of the cold, helpless fear that had been her skin for so long. It was love, a love that was not soft or gentle, but a wild, protective thing, a she-bear rising to defend its den. She shook her head. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, imbued with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "No." He stared at her, his brows drawing together in a dark line. "This isn't a discussion. Get in the cellar." "I'm not the little girl who hides under a coat anymore." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of independence, a statement of a truth that had been forged in this very cabin. She walked past him to the open gun chest. Her eyes fell upon a smaller pistol, a single-shot Derringer, lying in its own cloth. It looked small, almost like a toy, but she knew it was no toy. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was a rod of iron in her spine. "Ruthie, don't be a fool," he snarled, his voice a low, angry growl. He took a step toward her. She picked up the pistol. It was heavier than it looked, cold and solid in her trembling hand. She turned to face him, her chin lifted. "You taught Lem to be brave. Let me be brave, too. I can't hide. Not again. I will not let you face this alone." For a long, charged moment, they stood locked in a battle of wills. He looked into her eyes and saw not foolish defiance, but a fierce, unwavering loyalty. He saw the woman she had become, and he saw that to force her into the cellar now would be to break something far more precious than her body. It would be to break her spirit, the very spirit he had so patiently, so silently, helped to heal. A sound from outside broke the standoff, the unmistakable thud of horses' hooves entering the valley, slow and menacing. The time for argument was over. He gave a single, sharp nod, a look of grim, reluctant acceptance on his face. "The boy," he said, his voice tight. "They touch him, I'll burn the world down." "They won't touch him," she vowed, her knuckles white around the grip of the small gun. "I'll be right by the ladder. They won't get past me." He didn't waste another moment. He moved to the side of the door, pressing his back against the log wall, the long rifle held ready. Ruthie took her position by the cellar opening, her body a shield for the child hiding in the earth below. The cabin fell into a taut, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the steady, menacing approach of the horses. The footsteps stopped directly outside. A coarse voice, Jeb's voice, boomed through the thick wooden door. "Finch figured you'd find a hole like this to crawl into. Cowboy, send out the girl and we'll let you live." Beckett remained silent, a statue carved from shadow and resolve. "Have it your way," Jeb's voice snarled. The world exploded. The door didn't just open, it disintegrated. A cannonball of a kick shattering the heavy planks and sending splinters flying across the room. 3 figures filled the gaping, sun-drenched hole where the door had been. Jeb, barrel-chested and florid. The thin, rat-faced man, a wicked-looking knife in his hand. And the tall, silent one, his pistol already drawn. The cabin erupted in a deafening roar. Beckett fired the Winchester, The sound, a physical blow in the enclosed space. The rat-faced man screamed and staggered back, clutching his arm. Gunpowder filled the air, thick and acrid. The silent man returned fire, his shot going wide, gouging a long splinter from the ceiling beam above Ruthie's head. It was chaos, a nightmare of noise and violence and the smell of death. Ruthie pressed herself against the wall, the small pistol held in a two-handed grip, her heart trying to hammer its way out of her chest. She could hear a thin, terrified whimpering from the cellar below. Lem. Beckett worked the lever on the rifle, ejecting a spent shell, chambering another round. He was a whirlwind of deadly efficiency. Jeb, bellowing with rage, charged into the room, firing a shotgun that seemed impossibly large. The blast tore a huge, ragged hole in the wall where Beckett had been a second before. But Beckett had already moved, dropping to one knee, firing the rifle again. Jeb grunted, stumbling, but didn't fall. Then, from the corner of her eye, Ruthie saw the silent man. He had ignored the main fight, his cold eyes finding his target. He raised his pistol, aiming not at the whirlwind of Beckett, but at the place where Beckett would be when he rose. It was a cold, calculated, patient shot. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch like taffy. "Beckett," she screamed, her voice a thin, useless thread in the maelstrom of sound. Beckett rose, turning, bringing the rifle around. The silent man's pistol barked. A dark, wet flower bloomed on the side of Beckett's shirt, high on his ribs. He grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and his legs buckled. The Winchester clattered to the floor. He fell to one knee, his hand clutching his side, his face a mask of shock and pain. The world stopped. In that instant, everything fell away. The noise, the fear, the trembling in her hands. There was only Beckett, on the floor, bleeding. There was only the silent man, his pistol still smoking, a look of cold triumph on his face as he began to turn the weapon toward her. The little girl who hid under coats was dead and buried. The woman who loved him was here. A roar of pure, primal fury rose in her throat. She didn't aim. She didn't think. She lifted the small derringer, pointed it at the tall, silent figure, and pulled the trigger. The tiny gun bucked in her hand with a surprisingly loud crack. It was a sound dwarfed by the other blasts, but it was her sound. It was her rage-given voice. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of the silent man's chest. His eyes widened in a look of profound, ultimate surprise. He took a single, stumbling step backward, his pistol falling from his nerveless fingers. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only a soft sigh escaped. Then he crumpled to the floor in a boneless heap and did not move again. Jeb, wounded but still on his feet, stared in disbelief at his fallen comrade, then at the small, fierce woman with the smoking pistol. The fight, the rage, seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a sudden, superstitious fear. He looked at Beckett, struggling to rise, at the dead man on the floor, and at the wild-eyed girl who had killed him. It was too much. With a final, choked curse, he turned and scrambled out through the shattered doorway, the wounded, rat-faced man stumbling after him. The thunder of their horses' hooves, fleeing the valley, was the only sound. Then silence, a ringing, humming, terrible silence. A high-pitched, piercing wail rose from the darkness of the cellar. Beckett. Lem's scream broke the spell. Ruthie's gun hand dropped to her side, the small pistol suddenly an impossibly heavy weight. The room swam before her eyes. The acrid smell of gunpowder burned her throat. She was shaking so violently she thought her teeth would shatter, but she did not fall. She looked at Beckett. He was on his hands and knees, trying to push himself up, his face pale and slick with sweat. His hand was pressed tight to his side, and blood, dark and shockingly red, was seeping through his fingers. She scrambled to him, her knees hitting the splintered floorboards. "Beckett," she breathed, her voice ragged. He looked at her, his dark eyes clouded with pain, but in their depths, she saw something else, a fierce, burning pride. He had seen what she had done. "Ruthie," he whispered, and then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed, unconscious, onto the floor. Lem's screams from the cellar were a constant, terrified litany. She knew she had to get to him, to comfort him, but first, Beckett. She couldn't leave him here. With a strength born of pure adrenaline and desperate love, she hooked her arms under his shoulders. He was an impossible weight, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She strained, her muscles screaming, her feet slipping in the dust and debris. She pulled, inch by agonizing inch. She dragged him across the floor, away from the dead man, away from the shattered door, toward the simple cot that was his bed. A smear of his blood traced their path, staining the clean-scrubbed floorboards. It soaked into the hem of her dress, a dark, terrible crimson, but she did not falter. She would not let him die on the floor. She would not collapse. The storm had come and gone, and she was still standing. The aftermath of the violence was a ringing, deafening silence. For a long moment, Ruthie knelt on the floor, the dead weight of Beckett's unconscious form, a terrifying anchor to the blood-soaked reality of the room. The only sound was the high, thin wail of a terrified child rising from the dark hole in the floor. "Lem?" The name was a clarion call, cutting through the fog of her shock. She laid Beckett's head down gently, her hands coming away sticky and warm with his blood. Her gaze swept the room of horrors, the shattered door, the splintered wood, the still, silent form of the man she had killed. His surprised eyes staring at a ceiling he could no longer see. There was no time for fear. There was no time for revulsion. There was only what needed to be done. "Lem?" she called, her voice surprisingly steady. "It's all right now. You can come up. They're gone." A small, dirt-streaked face, pale with terror and streaked with tears, appeared at the edge of the opening. His eyes, wide as saucers, took in the scene, and he let out a choked sob, scrambling back into the darkness. "No, Lem, wait," she said, her voice softening. She crawled to the opening, keeping her body between him and the worst of the carnage. "Look at me. It's just me. You have to be a brave boy now. I need your help. Beckett needs your help." The mention of his name was the key. He slowly re-emerged from the cellar, his small body trembling uncontrollably. She pulled him into her arms, holding him tight against her, rocking him gently as he sobbed into her shoulder. "It's all right," she whispered over and over, a mantra against the horror. "We're safe, we're safe." When his sobs had quieted to ragged, hitching breaths, she looked him in the eye. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to go to the creek and bring back a bucket of the coldest water you can find. Can you do that?" He nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve. It was a task, a purpose. It would get him out of this room. She watched him scurry out through the broken doorway, a small, resilient figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. Then she turned to face the second task, the dead man. She could not bring Beckett back to consciousness in a room with a corpse. The thought of touching him, of the cold, heavy reality of what she had done, made her stomach churn, but she would not let Beckett wake to this. With a deep, shuddering breath, she grabbed the dead man by his boots and began to pull. It was a grim, ghastly struggle. She strained, her muscles burning, her feet slipping on the bloody floor. She did not look at his face. She focused only on the task, a single, necessary act of cleaning, of restoring some semblance of order to the chaos. She dragged him out onto the porch and left him there, a stark and terrible punctuation mark to the end of their ordeal. When Lem returned with the water, she was already by Beckett's side. The wound was a dark, ugly tear in the fabric of his shirt, oozing blood in a slow, steady rhythm. Panic tried to claw its way up her throat, but she forced it down. She remembered stories of women on the frontier, of how they dealt with wounds like this. Cleanliness, pressure, whiskey. Over the next hour, she worked with a feverish, focused intensity. She tore strips from her own petticoat, the last clean garment she owned. She boiled water on the stove, sterilizing a small knife in the flames. With trembling hands, she cut away the bloody shirt, exposing the wound. The bullet had gone clean through his side, a blessing of sorts, but he had lost so much blood. She cleaned the entry and exit wounds as best she could with whiskey and hot water, her touch surprisingly gentle despite the desperate urgency of her task. He moaned, a low, animal sound of pure agony, but he did not wake. She packed the wounds with the clean cloth and bound his ribs tightly, a clumsy but secure bandage. And then there was nothing left to do but wait. The days that followed blurred into a single, seamless vigil. The world shrank to the confines of the sick room, to the narrow cot where Beckett lay, lost in the gray, twilight country between life and death. Ruthie became a creature of pure, selfless routine, her own exhaustion a distant, irrelevant hum beneath the all-consuming needs of the man in the bed and the boy at its foot. A fever took hold of Beckett, and he thrashed in the throes of delirium, muttering dark, disjointed phrases about stampedes and dust storms and names she did not know. She was a constant, cooling presence at his side, wiping his brow with a damp cloth, forcing sips of cool water between his cracked lips. Her low, soothing voice a constant murmur in the hot, still room. Lem refused to sleep in his own bed. He made a small nest for himself on a pile of blankets at the foot of Beckett's cot. A tiny, devoted sentinel. He would watch Ruthie for hours, his solemn eyes tracking her every move, as if trying to learn the sacred rituals of care. At night, when the nightmares came for him, making him cry out in his sleep, she would not leave her post. She would simply reach down and stroke his hair, her voice dropping into the soft, melodic cadence of a lullaby her own mother had once sung to her. She sang for the terrified child and for the delirious man, her soft voice a fragile shield against the darkness that filled the cabin. She found a small, worn Bible on the shelf above the hearth, one of only 3 books in the cabin. In the long, quiet hours of the afternoon, she would sit by the bed and read from it in a low, steady whisper. She read the Psalms, the lyrical, ancient words of comfort and despair, a balm to her own frayed soul. She did not know if he could hear her, if the words penetrated the fog of his fever, but she read anyway. The sound of her own calm voice filled the space, pushing back against the silence and the fear. She kept the cabin clean, scrubbing the bloodstains from the floorboards until her knuckles were raw. She mended the shattered door as best she could, nailing a blanket over the opening to keep out the night chill. She cooked thin, nourishing broths on the stove, the savory aroma a small, defiant act of life in the face of death. She moved through the days in a trance of purpose, her entire being focused on the singular, monumental task of keeping this man, her silent protector, tethered to the world. On the 4th day, the fever broke. She woke in her chair to find him still, the violent thrashing gone. His forehead was cool and damp beneath her hand. His breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, was now deep and even. She watched him for an hour, her heart a wild, hopeful bird in her chest. His eyes opened. They were not clouded or distant. They were clear, dark, and utterly lucid. He didn't look at the ceiling, or the walls, or the blanket that covered him. His gaze did not wander. His eyes, his first conscious act, searched for and found her face. He looked at her as if she were the first and only landmark in a vast, featureless landscape, the one fixed point by which he could navigate his return to the world. A profound, unspoken recognition passed between them. He knew, on some deep, primal level, he knew she had been there all along. She could not speak. Words were too small, too clumsy for the immensity of what she felt. She simply met his gaze, her own eyes filling with the tears she had refused to shed for 4 days. He was too weak to move much, but with a slow, deliberate effort that seemed to cost him everything, he lifted his hand from the blanket. It was pale and unsteady, but it moved with purpose. He laid it over hers where it rested on the edge of the cot. His skin was cool, his touch light as a feather, but it was a touch that contained the weight of a lifetime. It was a thank you. It was an acknowledgement. It was a declaration more powerful than any 3 words could ever be. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She leaned forward, her voice a soft, tremulous whisper, offering him the only gift she had left to give. It was the truth of her own healing, the testament to the change he had wrought in her. "I'm not afraid anymore." It was the most profound confession she could make. She was no longer the frightened girl who had run from a monster. She had faced the storm, and she had not broken. She had been remade in the crucible of this valley, by his quiet strength and by the fierce, protective love she had discovered within herself. A flicker of something deep and powerful moved in the depths of his dark eyes. He did not smile. His face, etched with pain and exhaustion, was not capable of it, but his fingers, weak as they were, tightened around hers. His grip was a silent, unshakable promise. He did not let go, and, in the quiet, sun-drenched cabin, with the boy sleeping soundly at the foot of the bed, the true healing, the healing of 2 fractured souls, had finally begun. The high, relentless heat of summer softened, its edges blurred by a golden haze that signaled the slow turning of the seasons. Time, in the hidden valley, moved at its own pace, measured not in the frantic ticking of a clock, but in the healing of a wound, the fading of a scar, and the steady, quiet knitting together of 3 fractured lives. Peace returned. Not as a sudden event, but as a slow, creeping tide, reclaiming the land that had been briefly touched by violence and fear. Beckett's wound healed. The dark, angry tear in his side closed, leaving a puckered, silver scar that was now a part of the landscape of his body, a permanent reminder of the day the storm had broken over their home. His strength returned in slow, steady increments, his movements regaining their old, powerful economy, though sometimes, in the cool of the morning, Ruthie would see him press a hand to his side, a flicker of memory in his dark eyes. The scar was a part of their shared history now, a mark on his skin that corresponded to an invisible, indelible mark on her soul. The homestead healed, too, with wood salvaged from a fallen cottonwood. Beckett built a new door, thicker and stronger than the last. He fitted it with a heavy iron latch and a sturdy bar, his movements methodical and precise. He was not just closing an opening, he was securing their world. The bullet holes in the log walls he plugged with a mixture of mud and grass, smoothing the patches with his palm until they were barely visible. He mended the fences that bordered the valley, not because they were broken, but because it was his nature to restore order, to reaffirm the boundaries of the sanctuary he had built. And Ruthie healed. The nightmares of Alistair Finch, of the shouting men on the train, began to fade, their terrifying clarity dissolving like smoke in the wind. The constant, thrumming fear that had been the background music of her life for so long was replaced by a quiet, watchful calm. She had faced the worst the world had to offer, and she had not only survived, but she had fought back. She had discovered a core of steel within herself she never knew existed, a strength forged in love and desperation. Their days settled into a new kind of normal, a life built of small, significant rituals. The most important of these took place on the porch steps in the quiet of the afternoon, with a piece of charcoal and a smooth, pale plank of wood. Ruthie began to teach Lem his letters. She would guide his small, clumsy hand with her own, her touch infinitely patient, as he sounded out the strange, magical shapes. Else, she would say, her voice soft, like light or love. E, he would repeat, his brow furrowed in concentration. M, she would finish for him, like me or moon. He learned to write his own name first, Lem. He would practice it over and over, his tongue sticking out from the corner of his mouth, until the 3 letters were a proud, if wobbly, declaration of his own existence. It was more than just reading and writing. It was the careful, tender act of building a future, of planting a seed of knowledge in a boy who had had so little. From across the yard, Beckett would watch them, a long, still figure leaning against the corral fence. He would watch the way her head bent close to the boy's, the way her hand gently guided his, and a quiet, profound contentment would settle on his stern features. He was watching a family being forged in charcoal and sunlight. The air grew crisp, and the leaves on the cottonwood trees by the creek turned a brilliant, shimmering gold. It was on one such afternoon, bathed in the warm, slanting light of late autumn, that they all sat together on the newly repaired porch steps. No one was working. No one was speaking. Lem was in the middle, leaning his head sleepily against Beckett's thigh. Ruthie sat on the other side, her hands resting loosely in her lap. They were simply sharing the quiet, breathing in the peace of their valley. The world was awash in a deep, golden light, a perfect, fleeting moment of absolute tranquility. Ruthie looked out at the meadow. The vibrant wildflowers of spring and summer had faded, leaving behind dried stalks and seed heads that rattled softly in the breeze. But she knew that beneath the dry earth, the roots were still there, waiting. She turned her head, her gaze coming to rest on Beckett's profile. He was looking out at the distant mountains, his face calm and unguarded in the warm light. She thought of the day she had first seen him, a silent, intimidating mountain of a man on a dusty, dangerous train. She thought of the terrified, desperate girl she had been, a girl with nothing left but a prayer whispered to a stranger. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, filled with a quiet sense of wonder at the impossible distance she had traveled. "That day," she began, her eyes never leaving his face, "I only asked to hide under your coat." He turned his head slowly, his dark, earthy eyes meeting hers. He didn't speak. He had never been a man for unnecessary words. Instead, he reached over, his large, calloused hand completely covering hers where it rested on the step. His touch was warm and solid, a familiar, grounding pressure that spoke of history, of shared survival, of a bond forged in fear and tempered in violence. It was a touch that said, "I remember, I am here, I will always be here." She looked down at his hand covering hers, at the way his weathered strength enveloped her own. She was no longer that girl. She no longer needed to hide from the world. She had found her strength, not in his shadow, but in his light. She had found her courage, not behind him, but beside him. She lifted her gaze back to his, a small, sure smile touching her lips. "I don't need a coat anymore," she continued, her voice clear and steady. "I just need you beside me, rain or shine." It was her vow, her answer to his unspoken declaration. It was her heart, laid bare not in a whisper of fear, but in a statement of quiet, unshakable faith. It was a promise of partnership, a testament to a love that had grown, wild and beautiful and strong, in the harshest of soil. He did not smile. He did not lean in to kiss her. There was no grand, cinematic embrace. Their story had never been one for such things. Their love was a quieter, deeper language, spoken in silent gestures and steadfast presence. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a single, deliberate movement that was more eloquent than 1,000 sonnets. He turned his gaze from her face to the meadow beyond, and she turned with him, her hand still held firmly in his. Together, they looked out over the golden, sleeping fields, toward the place where the wildflowers had grown, and where, they both knew, they would grow again, and that was enough. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach more listeners, please also consider hitting the hype button to show your support.